The mountains of Switzerland were always profoundly symbolic to Jung. He told me once that for him the modern age began when the poet Petrarch became the first man to climb a mountain in the Alps. For Jung it was a sure sign that the age of medieval introspection had ended. From that moment European man started to look at the outer world with new eyes. I can say that for me, a new phase of the life of our time began when Jung climbed the mountains and explored the valleys of the unconscious within modern man. He realized how much we had lost by neglecting our inner world, how dangerously one-sided we had become in ignoring our intuitive and instinctive selves. By the age of 40, Jung's reputation as a psychiatrist was secure. He lived with his wife and 5 children on Lake Zurich. His 9 years of work with mental patients and 15 years of private practice had given him many of the facts he needed for understanding the conflicts in modern man, exemplified by the clash between science and religion.
The charge of mysticism hurled at Jung in this period was so particularly unfair, because in everything he'd been doing, he'd been showing the traditional thoroughness, as it were, of a Swiss watchmaker, putting a very delicate and infinitely complex timepiece together. He told me, for instance, that in this period, before he uttered another word about dreams, he worked through 67,000 dreams with his own patients. That's an idea of his thoroughness.
But Jung felt that he couldn't move on to understand conflict in others until he understood fully what had caused his own differences with Freud. Ostensibly they had parted company over Freud's insistence that sexuality was at the root of all man's conflicts and strivings. There was also Freud's own quarrel with his collaborator Adler, who was explaining everything in terms of an urge to power.
He often said, I know many people for whom a Freudian psychology is right, for others whom an Adlerian psychology is right, but neither express the whole man. Both are forms of one-sidedness. What constitutes the whole man? What is the secret of the whole personality? This became the driving aim of his life. But in examining the origins of the parting of ways with Freud, he suddenly realized, I'm up against type, a fundamental inbuilt psychology of type which varies in men. And he coined 2 new words, or rather used 2 old words in a new way to explain it. He suddenly realized that Freud was an extrovert and Adler was an introvert. And what is more, he found that within the framework of the extroverted and introverted personality, there were differences of psychological functions. He came to the conclusion that each human being had 4 functions, and that one of these functions always tended to be superior and specialized. And another function, also conscious, aided and abetted the superior function, and the remaining 2 tended to be pushed underground. And there were obvious, infinite numbers of combinations between these functions. I don't think it's important to analyze these functions and give them their names. But as a result of this, he wrote and formulated his conclusions in a book called The Psychology of Type, or The Theory of Individuation, this new word, which became the ultimate goal of his seeking. Individuation meaning that each human being had a specific nature and a calling which is peculiarly his own. And unless he fulfilled this calling in a non-one-sided way, unless he fulfilled this calling in such a way that the specialized superior functions were joined by the repressed unconscious functions sometime in life, and the man made a whole, man became sick. As the tribes in Africa used to say, man lost his soul. Or to use a word which I prefer, the psyche. And the psyche for him was this great objective world within, which he discovered and which he was going to explore now in order to find the wholeness of man. He had all the material available. And for him, this world within was just as great as the universe without. He often said to me, when you look inside yourself, you see the universe and all its stars and all their infinity objectively spread out, and you fall away into an infinite mystery, an infinite objective mystery within yourself, as great as the one without. Now, his psychology of types in this regard was extremely important, because it explained so much of why philosophers were always quarreling with one another, why scientists were quarreling with priests. That they didn't know that they were really after the same things in their different ways. And I personally think that this book of his, this work of his on the psychology of types, was of immense importance to mankind, difficult as it is, because for the first time, it gives human beings who are constitutionally, psychologically different, a chance of talking a common language, and not, as Anatole France once said, kill one another over the meaning of words, whereas if they'd understood what the words were trying to say, they would have embraced one another. Jung gave, through the psychology of types, the modern world a contemporary way in which all men could speak a common language. And from that moment, he felt free of Freud. He felt free of the past. He felt free to go all out to explore the objective psyche, because already he was convinced it was through centuries of one-sided neglect of the whole of the psyche that modern man was ill, that he was even more sick in his normality than he was sick in the asylums, that he was, as it were, a man in search of his soul, in search of his psyche. Until he found the way to that, he would never be well.
The churches of the day were beginning to empty. In his consulting room, Jung saw the consequences of this loss of faith. But however much those who still clung to their churches rejected the neurotic, Jung had become convinced that within a neurosis were the seeds of new growth. He had come to know this with certainty because, unlike the psychiatrists of his day, he didn't set himself apart from his patients. The doctor is effective, he wrote, only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. He had established empirically that dreams were a code of precious objective facts, informing the dreamer of his greater potential. He found that the moment he helped a patient to discover meaning in his neurosis, it was transformed into a source of positive energy. It was an indication of what St. Paul called the priesthood of the suffering, and that in this individual suffering there was a sense of what was inadequate in the attitude of a whole culture, of a whole civilization. And the last thing in the world I think that Jung wanted to do was really to remove people's sense of maladjustment. Of course, he wanted them to accept their social reality. as he accepted his. But he didn't want to remove from them their sense that the life of their time was hopelessly inadequate, because this is one of the most valuable things that the human being has. Tension. That's why the use of drugs are so wrong, that they try to remove the sense of tension inside the human being, which is the most valuable thing he has, to show him that his time is wrong and that he and his whole society needs changing. Yet professionally more isolated than ever, Jung had to look within for support. He had always felt that he had not only a number one personality who met the demands of society, but also a number two. In time, the number two personality of Jung assumed such definite proportions, such a clarity, that he could actually paint and draw it. And then, of course, seeing the drawing, one realizes immediately that this was a personification of one of the great archetypes, the archetype of the wise old man, the thing within all human beings which has a knowledge, a potentiality of all the life that has ever been and perhaps ever could be. Jung called the Philemon. We all have a Philemon within ourselves, whether we know it or not. Most of us don't realize it, because we find our Philemons in wise men and leaders in the world outside. In my fantasies, I held conversations with Philemon, Jung wrote. Philemon said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself, but in his views, thoughts were like animals in the forest or birds in the air, and added, if you should see people in a room, you wouldn't think that you had made those people. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity. It was precisely in order to promote this dialogue with his Philemon self that Jung sought the peace of a natural setting for a new kind of home at Bollingen. Gradually, through my scientific work, he wrote, I was able to put my fantasies and the contents of the unconscious on a solid footing. Words and paper, however, didn't seem real enough to me. Something more was needed. I had to achieve a kind of representation in stone of my innermost thoughts and of the knowledge I had acquired. Or to put it another way, I had to make a confession of faith in stone. That was the beginning of the tower, the house which I built at Bollingen. Kisnacht was Jung's fortress. This place in which I'm sitting was his own sanctuary. At Kisnacht, Jung had his fortress in the world. He did. He was functioning. He was active. Here in his sanctuary, Jung had his being. He was. He belonged, as it were, outside time. And he lived here extremely simply. He had no telephone. He had no electricity. It was a sort of place to which a man from the 16th century could come and feel completely at home. And it was wonderful to see him here making a fire and cooking. He was the most wonderful cook that I've ever met. And I don't think he worked really from a given recipe so much. He would have an idea in his mind, but he would invent the things as he went along. He took infinite pains about it. Jung surrounded his tower with trees. From childhood, trees had made him feel close to the deepest meaning of life. They expressed for him not only the beauty, but also the thoughts of God. always said, and he said so in public, that one of the troubles with modern man was that modern man had forgotten how to live the symbols in himself, how he'd forgotten to live the symbolic life. And now, for instance, he had found that even in the poorest house in India, there was always a tiny little corner which was regarded as private and sacred, to which the personality could withdraw, and where it could be at one with life and the universe. And this he lived out here himself. This intuition is enshrined in the last section of the house he built on top. It was a room in which he felt he could contemplate and commune with his number 2 personality, where he could commune with a nature which had always meant so much to him, and where he could be his timeless self. The dialogue he had begun with Stone as a lonely boy on the banks of the Rhine, here at Bollingen took on concrete form. The dream figures, the symbols, the mythological motives, which he had brought back from his exploration of the unconscious, he carved into the foundation of his tower. Here was striking evidence of a revolutionary new approach to dreams. Freud's attitude to dreams had been that he and his theory knew what the dreams were about. Jung's attitude was that in the first place, the dream was the personal possession of everybody who dreamed it. So the dream spoke a private language and a personal language, and it was a key to that particular individual's responsibility to his own unconscious dynamic, which he had not yet learned to respect and to bring into proper relationship with his conscious self. But deeper than that, there was a kind of dream which he had recognized first in the most unbalanced of his patients, but had then found in his ordinary patients, and then found particularly in his own visions. These were dreams that belonged to the whole of mankind, and they came from a level which Jung called the collective unconscious. Jung was satisfied that his dream as a child of a phallic divinity came from the underground of this collective unconscious. But he knew that one such dream was not enough to prove the validity of so revolutionary a concept. He set out to travel the world for further proof. By 1926, he was in the jungle, in the heart of Africa. Already he'd been among the Negroes and Indians of North America. He'd been to North Africa and gone deeply into the mythological development of India, Tibet, China, and Japan. Now, as he approached Mount Elgon, in the great Rift Valley of Africa, he felt nearer the end of his task. Everything he had found up to then confirmed his concept of the collective unconscious, that no matter what the race, the personality, or the culture, here was the level where all men were one, with access to forces of infinite growth, forces that revealed themselves in exactly the same symbols throughout the world. He hadn't come across a single myth, legend, religion, or dream which did not contain identical symbols. Now, as he lived among the people of Elgon, the new evidence was overwhelming. He told me, for instance, that their witch doctor drew the same distinction between dreams as he did, dividing them into personal and great dreams, equivalent to his own distinction between the dream from the personal unconscious and the dream from the collective unconscious. And from Elgon, he set off towards the Nile, perhaps the greatest mythological river in history. Of all Jung's journeys, his trip to Africa made the most profound impression on him. In his old age he wrote to me, "I shall never cease to thank the fates that wove the pattern of my life, that they included the experience of Africa and all its wonder." As he journeyed down the Nile back to the modern world, he felt more than ever that European man had a forgotten, primitive, myth-making man within him. It was the loss of contact with this instinct of self, this rural mind as he had called it as a student, which had caused modern man's own myth, the great myth of Christianity, to lose its power of renewal. The task of bringing out of the unconscious this neglected primitive within us, and of making it an honored partner of our conscious selves, seemed to him the only way to wholeness, the only way to healing the sickness of our time. But the last thing Jung wanted as he traveled among the ruins of the great civilization of Egypt was to see the Western world vanish likewise. The more he had traveled, the more he valued his own cultural inheritance. One of his last memories of Africa was that of a snake heraldic in the sun, the snake which in the world of primitive man as well as in the ancient world of Greece was a symbol of everlasting renewal and healing. Though Jung's world might be sick, he was convinced that it was great enough to achieve renewal. He was going home determined to dedicate himself more than ever to the task of healing. At Küsnacht, Jung began to enlarge and deepen his research. In all forms of personal and cultural derangement, it found a break of continuity between past and present. His reading of the neglected areas of history and philosophy gave him a new insight into how that loss of continuity had come about in European man. He saw, for instance, how Christianity had maimed itself by cutting out the work of the Gnostics, who had tried to revitalize narrow dogma with their own living experience of religion. He recognized the despised alchemists as pioneers in his own field. His reading confirmed his notion of constant and recurring patterns and motives in the spirit of man, primordial images, which he called archetypes. Two of the greatest of these he named anima and animus, the feminine in man and the masculine in woman. The animus is the creative self in woman. As in the case of Emma Jung and her book on the Holy Grail, it leads woman to a creative role beyond that of being a mother. But for Jung, a man in a world dominated by men, the neglected feminine motive, the anima, was crucial. The anima is one of the greatest of the archetypes, because it is a personification, as it were, of all the feminine values of life, which is so necessary for man to be his full creative self. One can think of these many examples of this personification of this great archetype in the history of man. Venus, Persephone, Ariadne, and much nearer to our own time, as part of the great reawakening of the European spirit in the Renaissance, as the Beatrice who led Dante down into the depths of hell and up again into the heights of heaven. And very early on, Jung had an intimation of the existence of this personification of the anima, of this imagery of the anima, which appeared in his own dreams and in his own life. And he realized its importance as a great reconciling factor between the split of conscious man from his unconscious self, that this too was a built-in pattern in the spirit of every man that could take and lead him down into the depths of his unknown self, if properly understood, and bring him up again into his conscious self with a greater form of awareness than he had before. The first charting of the unknown sea of man's unconscious here in Zurich was carried as far as Jung, for the moment, could carry it. He now felt free to turn to the problems of what he called the last quarter of life. Where does man stand in the scheme of things? What is his responsibility to the universe and time? Reality and events seen merely as a chain of pure cause and effect made no sense to him. He felt convinced that one of the misfortunes of Western thinking was precisely this view of looking at our history and looking at our future in terms of mere cause and effect. He was convinced that somewhere there was another principle at work, and this too came to him from intimations of his own unconscious self. And these things were manifested to him particularly through the way in which in dreams, sometimes a way one couldn't explain, the future would be foretold, when there was no cause, as yet even, to cause that particular future. It came to him through what we were inclined to dismiss as mere coincidence. And through his linking up with the ancient Chinese way of thinking, his own concept of this other principle became clearer, and he was convinced that this was due to modern man's misconception of the nature of time. Modern man saw time purely as a measure. Jung thought there was something far more to time than that. He was already impressed by the role in which the conscious, unconscious, collective unconscious in particular, transcended time, seemed to be beyond time. And he was impressed more and more by the fact that time had a nature and character of its own, and that out of the nature and character of its own, it contribute to the nature and character of life on earth. But the important thing of seeing life causally, that is, not in terms of cause and effect, is that it's an immense act of psychological emancipation, because it frees man from this dreadful feeling which scientific specialists have implanted in modern man, that he's a slave of cause and effect, that if something is done to him at a certain point, he's almost forced to react to it in a predetermined way. But this shows that man, in cooperation with time, can use what the scientist up to now calls a cause as the base material, as the alchemist used base matter. And he has a freedom of choice to use it in a creative way and to turn it into something completely new. For Jung, too, the completion of this concept was an act of liberation, a liberation from the demands of the here and now he had served so well. He felt free to imagination more, to death and beyond.